It is becoming a truism that we live in the era of networks. That is, just about anywhere we turn, we bump into some kind of network. And one question that obviously comes up, that is this a new phenomenon, or this is actually something that we've been living with networks for a long time and never noticed. But before we go there, probably we should start thinking about what is a network. And there are many networks around us, whether we notice them or not. The most familiar to all of us is obviously the World Wide Web and the internet.
As a social scientist, we're always trying to figure out, well, why do people do stuff, right? And networks really give us a very different way of thinking about this, because for a really long time, we have thought about individuals as though they were islands. That they're, this is a Robinson Crusoe model of social science. And then to be able to integrate this information, not just about people, but about their relationships, is something that's completely new. What's happening in that whole complex set of relationships that we can learn about that we never knew before just by looking at each individual human being.
The question that everybody asks about networks is, so what? Do we ever see its consequences? So, and I guess people these days point to the Obama campaign as saying this is where network science leads you. So can you tell me a bit, you're much more familiar with that one, of how was the network concept actually infused in the Obama campaign?
Well, they seemed to be very successful especially particularly at mobilizing young people. A lot of this stuff sort of started with the Dean campaign, sort of realizing the importance of using the internet to mobilize people, and doing things like accessing the social network. So rather than sort of knocking on someone's door and cold calling them, you make sure that it's neighbors that are interacting. You help them have coffees with one another where they'll discuss the candidates. And so you're really sort of promoting social interaction. But what Obama, I think, really did is he took this to a larger scale. And with Web 2.0, it made it really, really easy. The second thing they did, which was, I think, counterintuitive to some economists, is they allowed people to donate any amount of money they wanted to, even donations as small as $1. Now, the fixed cost of them doing that was actually more than the amount that they would get from the person. But what they realized is that two things happen. One is, once you give a little bit, you're probably more motivated to give a lot later on. And the second thing is that once you give, that spreads in your social networks. You go to your friend and say, I gave money to the Obama campaign. They don't have to know it was just $1, but they hear that, and then they're more inclined to give as well. And so this fundraising was just off the charts. And I'm sure that as we read the tea leaves going forward, we're going to find that social networks were a big part of that story. And I think going forward, every campaign is going to be run this way, because they're going to see how successful this one was.
That's right. Always the winning campaign is full of geniuses, and it's imitated by everybody. Yes.
That's right. Campaigns in politics are sort of like evolution, right? So because only the survivor wins, and people will try to copy the better strategy, and so it's really sort of this mechanism like you have in evolution that promotes the use of these networks.
Well, a good example of that is the New York Times carried recently an article how the Netanyahu campaign in Israel has completely copied the Obama website, including the colors.
Really?
And the methodology, and every single button was exactly the same. So, and they said that, and they were kind of contrasting that Netanyahu's message is completely the opposite to what the Obama stands for in US. So you mentioned this concept, the fundamental difference between social networks and all non-social networks, and biological, technological, that in social networks, the hubs tend to connect to each other. In all other networks, from technological to biological, the hubs tend to shun each other, essentially, and connect to many small nodes. So, which raises, we never talked about the fact of, what do we mean by all these networks being similar to each other? And I think it's a good point to talk about, that the fact that there are a couple of really fundamental organizing principles that is common between networks. One of them that has gotten lots of attention in the scientific community is the very existence of the hubs. That is, in all these different networks that really have nothing to do each other, from the cell that has developed over 4 billion years, or the World Wide Web that has a 20-year history, or the internet has a 50-year history, all of them develop naturally these hubs. And so somehow these networks always develop, and they always converge to the same underlying structure. And I think that understanding what is developing that's because they really have no choice. All networks develop through dynamical processes of adding new nodes to the new links and nodes to the existing network, so they grow. And what we learned in the last few years is that this growth process fundamentally limits of how the network could look like. And that naturally leads to these kind of properties of hubs and associativity and so on.
Well, I think that this idea of the hubs being present in all these different levels of networks really sort of takes us back to Darwin. And for me in the social sciences is a little more controversial, but there's this, I think what we're going to find is that natural selection is what causes hubs to emerge in all these different social networks. And so you have natural selection operating on the cell, you have it operating on the evolution of the brain, and recently Nicholas Christakis and Christopher Dawes and I have found evidence that there's a genetic basis for human social networks, and that the number of people who name you as a friend is actually heritable, and about half of the variation in the in degree can be explained due to variation in the genes that people have.
I don't understand that. Can you elaborate? So what do you mean that it can be heritable, the number of people who... So my genes affect how many people would name me as friends?
Yes. And so one...
Can I get that gene?
Yeah, that's fine. And some of it makes sense, right? So attractive people, physically attractive people, people who communicate well, people who have assets are probably going to be more attractive. So this is about half genes and half environment. And given the genes, we were startled at how strong sort of the genetic effect was. But to me, what this really says is that human social networks have been operating under natural selection for a real long time. Since we were walking around on the plains of the Serengeti and the Pleistocene. And I think that what we're going to find is that these sort of forces are still with us today. And one interesting thing is that I really appreciate the effort to try to explain the variation between the hubs and the isolates in these physics models from a single underlying principle. But what this really suggests is that it's not necessarily sort of inherent homogeneity or similarity that brings about some of this variation. It's actually inherent variation. There are things that make each of us unique as human beings that give us a unique place in the social network. And the fact that we're finding this sort of genetic relationship makes me wonder if there's actually genetic purpose. And that is that natural selection might have acted on us to make sure that we have a variety of people who are hubs and who aren't hubs. We have a variety of people who are in these dense networks and these people who would act as bridges between groups.
I want to actually test on you one idea. So, which is...
Save it for the end.
Yes. Which is, it's unquestionable that the 20th century was the kind of the century of understanding the cosmos and particles, so understanding nature around us, that's where, elementary particle theory was developed. We built huge accelerators. We went to the moon, essentially, so all of these kind of things, so from the very small to the huge one, essentially, has been explored. What I see in many people call the 21st century the century of networks or complexity. And what I see that at the same time that in the way the kind of network thinking emerges and explodes and takes everybody's interest over, we also see a change in the fundamental interest in science. And I know whether it's good or not, we seem to have lost the appetite to go to the small and to the big. I mean, my son doesn't want to be an astronaut any longer. I asked him many times, would you like to go to the moon? And he said, no, I don't care about that, But he deeply cares about Facebook. He deeply cares about the internet. He deeply cares about the World Wide Web. So I think that this network explosion is also kind of, at least coincides with humanity turning inwards. So I wonder, do you feel that the society is really turning inwards? I mean, if you look at where the youth is really right now, they seem to be at a completely different stage than where we were. Certainly when I grew up, I thought that the biggest thing could ever happen in my life is to go to the moon or go to the space. And that's what I don't see actually in the younger generations. Do you see that change?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that this turning inward is also a function of the fact that people like you would be out of a job if you didn't start thinking about social science, right? So there are so many questions that have actually been resolved in physics that a lot of your colleagues are sort of turning to other places to sort of use these tools. And so because we've already sort of maxed technology so much, especially in terms of technology that can really affect us with the creation of global warming, with the creation of nuclear weapons where we could wipe out the planet all at once. I think there's been this sort of realization that maybe we ought to be putting our best and brightest minds to work on this question of how we all get along.
These questions were on our mind we could not address it. We didn't know how the molecules interact in the cell. We didn't know, who are our friends. And the technology has created the opportunity, and suddenly this vacuum of